In this video, we're going to uncover an incredible true crime story in which an unexpected couple of a young woman who previously worked as a nurse and a convicted murderer managed to steal $3.1 million in one of the richest cities in America in broad daylight, and successfully evade the governmental security agencies for 12 years, committing the largest heist in which the perpetrators haven't been captured. This crime story begins with the exploration of the perpetrators' past and a glimpse into their lives to see what caused them to become the focus of today's episode. First would be Heather Catherine Tallchief. She was born in Buffalo, New York, in 1972, in a poor family of two high schoolers who lived a tumultuous and unpredictable life, spending their time partying, drinking, and using drugs, constantly being in contact with police. All in their house and right in front of her, her brother and little sister, which prompted their problems with substance abuse from an early age. One day, her mother decided to leave and left Heather and other children alone with their father, divorcing him and leaving him the custody. Then, one of the women who were frequently partying there started a relationship with her father and played the role of their stepmother, who showed a clear dislike towards them throughout their childhood. Growing up in such a dysfunctional environment, she was often neglected and overlooked, lacking true parental love and support, leaving her with hopes of a better life. Around 1988, when she was 16 years old, she moved to San Francisco and lived with her biological mother. Soon after finishing school, she earned a diploma as a certified nursing assistant and worked at the city's hospitals for several years. At her job during the 90s, she very often worked with cancer and AIDS patients, with whom she developed close emotional relationships, because of which she was feeling torn psychologically when many of them eventually passed away after a long time of treatment and care. Such a heavy burden led to her turning back to using drugs and losing her job as a result. As with her being at rock bottom and desperate, she started a life in nightclubs as a frequent visitor, where in 1993, at 21 years old, she finally met Roberto Solis, with whom she would develop a relationship in the future, both a romantic and a criminal one. Now it's time to look at Roberto himself. Roberto Solis was born in 1945 in Managua, Nicaragua. Although there isn't much information about his early years based on the police and prison records, his life of crime began very early. For his entire criminal career, he is known for using up to 30 pseudonyms to hide his identity. One of the examples would be his failed robbery of an elderly Loomis-armed car guard in San Francisco in 1969, who showed him the empty money bag by turning it inside out and was still fatally shot by him in the back. Well, after this, he was sentenced to life in prison with an attempted escape, where he spent 20 years. In the prison, he didn't waste his time and decided to dedicate it to writing, specifically poetry. As some even commented, he considered himself to be a real intellectual, an art dealer. During this time, he wrote 5 books under one of his aliases, Pancho Aguilera, the contents of which captured the attention of some well-known writers and artists who literally petitioned the parole board to grant him leniency, presenting his works as proof of his change. And as a result, he was released from the prison early in 1991. He returned back to San Francisco, where in 1993 he and Heather would meet at one of the nightclubs, commencing their relationship and future cooperation in the biggest heist in Las Vegas history. Our story continues at the moment when they met each other at one of the nightclubs of San Francisco. As mentioned before, she was very disappointed in herself, aimless and lacking a sense of purpose, while Roberto, who was 27 years older than her, was very confident and presented himself as a thoughtful and loving person who also had a lot of experience in life. After they started talking, she got very intrigued by him because of his charisma and mystic aura, as well as his willingness to listen to her about her problems with losing her job, generally going through a hard time, and lacking a good human connection pretty much since childhood. Some time after that, he even invited her to his apartment. There they spent time talking and using drugs, and she was amazed by some of his hobbies and interests, like the occult, magic, and spirituality, with his apartment being full of various ritualistic things, altars, cards, and so on, as well as books of literature and his own poetry. After some time of their conversation, she fell in love with him, and, as she herself later noted, she finally started feeling a real sense of comfort, security, and love with this person. They began a relationship, and even though she knew about his criminal past, she thought it was rather cool and truly believed that he had changed. Well, after some time, she decided to move in with him and live her romantic and happy life with Roberto, who gave her all his attention and care. But then, one night he called her and asked her to be ready to go. She obviously asked where and why, but he simply answered, "Be ready and bring clothes." She did as he asked. After they were driving in his car for some time, He came out and asked her to look after the car and the keys inside and make sure nothing happens. Then, several minutes later, he returned with a bag of money, around $30,000, and a gold Rolex. Turns out he robbed a nearby mall. She was excited about his wild and unpredictable behavior and considered it somewhat special that he wouldn't just work like normal people. It wasn't in his nature. His adventurous attitude really spoke to her and made her life full of fun and adrenaline, which she enjoyed. After this experience, she connected with him on another level, a criminal one. She was excited about the easy money and having a love of her life by her side, everything she could have dreamed about, so she was willing to do anything for him, or with him. Not a long time afterwards, they started preparing for something big, which they started with Roberto contacting some of his buddies to manufacture for them fake documents, IDs, driver's licenses, credit cards, and so on, to establish their false identities and proceed with the plan of action. She trusted and believed in him, so she was ready and willing to do what he planned to do to ensure their freedom, wealth, and relationship. After obtaining the fake documents, they got on the move and relocated to Las Vegas the same year, 1993. After establishing themselves and getting comfortable, Roberto relayed to her the rest of the plan, which consisted not only of the mechanics of the heist itself, but also of the ways to successfully hide and secure themselves, and the money by constantly changing how they looked and behaved, as well as their documents. She was impressed and was ready to proceed further. First, her task was to apply for work at Luma's as a truck driver, which was the same armored security company distributing huge amounts of cash for casinos, banks, and ATMs that Roberto had tried to rob in 1969. During her interview, she lied about having previous experience working as a security guard for an art collector, Julius Suave, which happened to be one of Roberto's aliases. This all was to utilize Heather as an insider, who could gain the access and trust necessary for the heist. At her job, she spent her time memorizing the routes of the cars and the locations where the money was the most often requested, as well as gaining the trust of her co-workers and partners. The trucks at the Loomis are operated by three-person groups, while one is driving. The other two are delivering and replenishing the money in the ATMs all around Las Vegas. For such a rich city, the trucks were often packed with millions of dollars at a time. All the important information and her progress on the job she conveyed to Roberto, who was happy about the smoothness of the operation. After her detailed documentation of all the routes, employees, schedules, and so on that could be relevant, Roberto and Heather started preparing for the action. Heather was notified about a scheduled refilling of one of the biggest casinos in Las Vegas on Friday, the busiest day for their job before the weekend. They knew that this was their chance to act. So on October 1st, 1993, she together with her two partners, Scott and Steve, were moving towards their first stop, Circus Casino. Their plan was to drive away the truck with the majority of cash while her two partners were inside the casino refilling the ATMs. This was also the only place where she had to drop them off at one location and then pick them up at another in about 20 minutes, since she was known for constantly being late or just forgetting how to get to their pickup location. They wouldn't notice immediately that something was wrong. As for the truck itself, Roberto rented a garage with the Steel Reinforcement Services banner on it, on the way of her route, to which she would need to drive the truck with the money without anyone noticing. Even though her conscience was telling her that robbery wasn't something good, she justified it in her mind as not a robbery of a hard-working regular person, but a money-gambling conglomerate, which preyed on people's uncontrollable desires and urges to win at least some of it, which they of course never do. So after dropping them off, they waited for her to return, but she never did. At first they thought that maybe she was abducted or hijacked in some way, because they couldn't contact her even via radio, while one of them even jokingly proposed, what if she took the money and ran away? And soon, enough time had passed and it wasn't funny anymore. They contacted their boss as soon as possible, and the FBI began an investigation. The FBI agent assigned to the case was Joseph Duszek, nicknamed Bulldog for his seriousness and stubbornness on the job as an investigator. He talked with every employee at the company relevant to the case, and also reviewed all security documents and footage. He and his team concluded that based on the available evidence, it seemed that no one had robbed the van or interfered with Heather in any way, which meant she probably stole it herself. The money in the truck was $3.1 million. Nobody could have imagined her to be a criminal robber in their wildest dreams, a young girl from a poor family, with a nurse certificate and work experience with sick patients, and no previous record of breaking the law. Unbelievable. But maybe that was the point. As she drove into their secret garage, Roberto closed the door, and they immediately began changing their attire and fake documents. since they knew that the best way to get away successfully is to change everything about them as much as possible. For Heather, it was chosen to dress as an elderly woman in a wheelchair with gray hair and old clothes, while Roberto would be her care assistant. They quickly began packing and loading the money into bags, boxes, and luggage, and put it into their car's trunk. After driving to the nearest post office, they shipped it to their final destination, which was Miami, while they drove to the airport and flew to Denver on a private chartered jet while evading all the security agents and guards. The first part of the heist is now complete. Next would be the final and even more serious one, to successfully get away with the money and not get caught. After arriving in Denver, they went to a rented motel room that they had reserved ahead of time and changed their clothes and identities yet again, completely throwing off any possible lead after them, and left in a hurry to get on the nearest train and zigzag across the country to get to Miami. Well, for the next several days, they hid at a Miami hotel and waited for the postal delivery of the money, and after receiving it, they brought it to their apartment. Heather was absolutely ecstatic to see all this money, since from the beginning she dreamed about finally living peacefully on a farm somewhere with her loved one, and all the money they would need for a lifetime. And after a little moment of relief and excitement, they began packing the cash into their suitcases and preparing for the next and final move, leaving the country with all the money. But with their final preparations, which took about a month, they got ready, getting their disguises and fake documents, as well as researching where they could go, because some countries could extradite them back. They decided that the best choice for them was Amsterdam, the Netherlands. During this time, she took a pregnancy test and found out that she was positive. Well, after their journey of traveling to Amsterdam, their relationship began to worsen. Roberto didn't have time for her and their child and clearly wasn't living for her anymore. While she worked as a hotel maid, trying to make ends meet, Roberto went to parties and wasted the money on drinking, drugs, other women, expensive things, and so on. She started seeing the truth, that her idealized dreams about life were just that, dreams. She knew deep down that such a carefree, adventurous person like Roberto wouldn't just stop and settle calmly with her as a real family, but still continued to hope. Several years had passed, and the investigation and the manhunt back home continued as well. As the investigation continued, since the time Heather couldn't be found, the agents felt stuck since the heist was so clean and still had a lot of questions to answer. Regardless, based on the data, the team already suspected an involvement of other accomplices, just because of the nature of the crime. Since they didn't know where else to look, besides monitoring the streets and looking at the video camera footage throughout the city, the FBI agent Dushek decided to go on the news and make an official public appeal for any information about the fugitives. Fortunately, an elderly man contacted them some time afterwards and said that he saw the woman on the TV with a man, and they rented his apartment. The investigation team immediately went there and broke the door. Of course, there was no one in there by that time. This was Roberto's apartment in Las Vegas, where he and Heather lived right before the heist. The first thing they noticed was a huge number of ritualistic and spiritual objects everywhere. Those belonged to Roberto. Also, they found maps, some travel brochures, and yet the apartment looked like someone was trying to clean it up. But in the closet, they found one Luma's armored uniform shirt, which made them think that whoever was working with her, they'd planned it ahead of time. They found some personal things in the apartment as well, and decided to try taking the fingerprints. After the results came, they were shocked. Some of the fingerprints were from Heather Tall Chief, but others were from Roberto Solis. They couldn't believe it. A 20-something-year-old with an almost 50-year-old convicted murderer together. They right away suspected that maybe he was manipulating or blackmailing her, and then would just dispose of her. So they were reasonably worried. And after adding them to the FBI's most wanted list, they shared their full information and identities on various media, now together, on TV, newspapers, radio, etc., in case someone would know something. They continued the search, and soon they found the garage itself, with the van, their left clothes, and boxes, while already almost all the governmental and other security departments and teams were sifting through the US to find them. They were finally contacted by some of the airport workers, drivers, flight attendants, and others about a suspicious couple they saw boarding on a private jet on the day of the robbery. The FBI reviewed the videotapes and were amazed at their elaborate scheme to pretend to be an elderly woman in a wheelchair, literally hiding in front of everyone's eyes. Even though they were impressed by it, they knew that this meant that Heather and Roberto knew what they were doing, and it would be really difficult to find them. They were right. By the time the police and the FBI found all their fake documents and discovered their rented rooms and apartments, they were already gone from the country. This was literally the first case in Agent Dushek's decades-long work experience when he couldn't arrest the perpetrators, which only showed their proficiency and the quality of their cooperation. Well, the years went by, and the FBI, as well as other security departments, started to lose hope of ever catching them, since they might have already been anywhere in the world. and even multinational cooperation might not help. But with the lack of any new leads, and even some false reporting of information provided by people who wanted a monetary reward from the FBI for useful information, the case went cold. Statistically, cases that go on for more than 24 months have a very low chance of ever being solved. Back in Amsterdam, after Heather had her child and the relationship between her and Roberto began to crumble, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to break up with him and try to live on her own in Amsterdam. He didn't show any resistance, and as she noted, it's like he didn't even care. He gave her some money and sent her on her way, on her plans of having a happy family and making the future for her child were failing. After this experience, her view on life changed. She suddenly understood what was truly important in her life and what were just childish things. She decided to fully dedicate her life to her son, to raise him and ensure his successful future as well as a normal life in the present. Many years later, her son was growing up in a peaceful atmosphere, went to a local school, and had friends. Life seemed to go well, yet Heather wasn't happy. She constantly felt like she was an imposter, living like another person, in a false reality, and was tired of always looking over her shoulder in case she would be discovered by the authorities and her child would be taken from her. In 2005, 12 years after the heist and her escape, her fake documents neared their expiration date, and now she was faced with a choice: to try and make a new fake identity in some other place, which would also affect her son, or to make an attempt to make things right. She chose the latter option. She contacted an attorney in the US, asking for assistance in her case to help her come back to the States, ensure her son's safety, and represent her in court as she turns herself in. The attorney she contacted was shocked by this and was very excited to help her. One of her main stated motives for surrendering and facing persecution was to help her son to have a normal life as an American citizen. The attorney agreed and prepared a plan. His objectives were to help her get to the US, go on a fair trial, and make her serve the least amount of time possible. He believed that since she would surrender of her own will, she would get a lower sentence because it would indicate her remorse and a willingness to redeem herself as a member of society. And also the fact that she didn't use any weapons or violence during the heist and even afterwards played a role in her receiving a lower sentence. At the end, in September 2005, at 33 years old, after being on the FBI's most wanted list for 12 years, she flew to Las Vegas and turned herself in. She stood a trial, facing 10 felony charges, such as bank embezzlement, credit union embezzlement, possession of fraudulent documents, and others, to which she pleaded guilty. Technically, she was facing up to 40 years in federal prison, but with her defense arguing for her as a remorseful person, willing to take responsibility, her sentence was lowered to 5 years, and in order to repay $3 million back to Loomis Company. As she noted after the trial, "I'm doing it for him, her son. I feel that by turning myself in and surrendering, I can give him a better life, one that he deserves." She was released in 2010 and spent the following 5 years under federal supervision. She still lives in the US, works in the healthcare system, and is close with her son Dylan. As for Roberto, he is still on the list of the FBI's most wanted. No one knows where he could be, but since so much time has already passed, he would already be 76 years old. So the authorities presume that by this time he is probably deceased. This was a truly fascinating account about an almost perfect crime. And maybe, if everything was better between Heather and Roberto, they could have both eventually got away with it. But the history is often unpredictable, and so even this outcome is more than favorable in her case. If you've enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to support the channel by liking and subscribing. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave them in the comments below. See you in the next one.